Kale, a hardy cool season green with few rivals. Rich in vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants, kale is as nutritious as it is delicious. It's an easy crop to grow and everyone can be successful with it. But to get that sweet, hearty, rich flavor and that lush evergreen foliage, kale does need a few things from us first. You see, to grow the best kale with the most flavorful leaves you've ever had, it's all about timing and environment. When to plant kale is just as important as all those other things, such as light, water, soil, and nutrients. And we'll cover all of that today. Grab a chair and your favorite bevy. We're about to dive into the wonderful world of kale. Kale is what's known as a non-heading brassica, meaning its central leaves don't form a flower-like structure or cluster. Despite all being classified as the same species, Brassica oleracea, kales, broccolis, cauliflower, and cabbages couldn't look more different. And kale differentiates itself even further from those guys by not creating that unique cluster of growth. But it's this lack of a fruiting head that makes kale so appealing to grow. Whenever you're growing a crop purely for the foliage, it becomes infinitely easier to be successful with it. Not to mention, it lends itself to being multi-harvested. And that's certainly the case with kale. Once established, you can keep harvesting the leaves time and time again. Not only can you harvest kale in half the time as the other brassicas, but you can keep harvesting it over and over again, all throughout its life cycle. Just because a plant is overly productive and super easy to grow doesn't mean you should. Fortunately, kale has a lot of other things going for it. For starters, it's absolutely packed with nutrition. Fiber, antioxidants, calcium, vitamins A, C, and K, iron, and even potassium. But it doesn't stop there. In addition to being chock full of nutrients, kale also tastes good. It's much sweeter and much more mild than its cruciferous cousins. If the thought of Brussels sprouts or cabbage gives you pause, kale could be that answer to you eating more greens. Enjoy it cooked or raw. Incorporating kale into your everyday diet is just as easy as growing it. And speaking of growing, it's time we did just that. Let's take a look at kale's basic requirements and get our grow on. Like we said, kale is a cool weather crop, requiring reduced temperatures to keep its leaves both healthy and tasting great. As such, there are two preferred times to be planting your kale out in your garden within a calendar year. Really early in the spring so that you can begin harvesting before that heat of summer, and then again in midsummer so that the plants are ready for the fall or even winter harvests. If you live in a really warm climate though, look to be getting your kale into the ground about 6 to 8 weeks before your coldest day of the year. As you can see, the timing of our planting is completely controlled by the timing of when we want to harvest. Getting the kale into the ground about 8 weeks before you want to be harvesting ensures that you're harvesting the best leaves. And by into the ground, I don't mean the seeds. Kale is almost always pre-started elsewhere, like indoors or a greenhouse, and then planted outside as a well-established plant. More on that a bit later though. Okay, back to those requirements. Now, kale does enjoy full sun, but being the versatile plant that it is, it'll tolerate partial shade, especially in those warmer climates. For soil, kale loves a well-drained, fertile, rich in organic matter loam with a neutral pH. Like all brassicas, they like it moist, but never wet or soggy, and certainly not anaerobic. And with those tough, weather-worn leaves, exposure is hardly ever a problem. High winds and rain just don't seem to affect established plants. Young transplants, however, like this dinosaur kale here, do need to be protected from the high heat and winds initially. For a complete tutorial on the hardening off process, check out this video here. All right, now that we know more about kale than we can possibly ever remember, it's time to start planting. As you can see, I got a bunch of dinosaur starters here that are ready to plant. But before we get dirty, let's take a trip back and see how I got them to this point. And for that, we're going to need to rewind about 2 months. For sure, you can simply buy your kale starters. They're not expensive and they're readily available every spring. If you're like me, however, and you like to do things start to finish, well, this next part's for you. Not to mention, if we're planting kale for a fall harvest, those summer starter plants are virtually non-existent. Using small pots or even plug trays, I fill them up with a seeding soil mixture. These soil mixes are very light and very airy, and they're great with moisture retention. Perfect for seed starting. Before seeding the trays, pre-soak that soil from below for about 2 hours. It makes the process so much easier. Next, make a shallow depression, less than a ½ inch deep. Kale is sown right near the surface. You don't want to plant these guys deep. Place a single seed in the center and then close up the hole. I try to germinate my kale seeds at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and at that temperature, they spring up in less than a week. Like in most plants, the cotyledons, or seed leaves, sprout up first, with the obvious true leaves coming out the center within a week after that. About a week after sprouting, right when you start to see those true leaves, reduce the temperatures to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep the light high though, at least 12 hours of full spectrum light per day. Kale can be grown like this all the way up till transplant time. Now, I seed a lot more kale than I need. That way I can choose the best specimens for my garden. One more step that is optional, however, is around a month or so after sprouting, take those kale plants that are showing the most promising growth and move them onto a larger pot. You don't have to do this step, but it really does help. It really lets those kale plants explode, and by the time you're planting them in the garden, they're almost adult size. These guys are the same age. Either way, 2 months after you started the seeds, the kale starters are ready for the garden. This also gives us the timeline of when to start our seeds in the first place. If we know we want to get these guys in the ground 2 months before harvest, and you want to start your seeds 2 months before that, we know it's about 4 months before our preferred harvest window to start our seeds. Okay, great, but when is that preferred harvest window? In northern climates, we want to be harvesting when the weather is cool. Not cold, but cool. So ideally, spring and fall. In southern climates, where the weather is much warmer, we want to be harvesting at the coldest part of the year. So, for a spring harvest where I live in Zone 9, I time my outdoor planting with the week after my last spring frost date. Count back 2 months from that date, and that's when I start my seeds. For a fall harvest, I want my plants in the ground outside around 8 weeks before my first fall frost date. So I take that fall frost date, which is usually in November, count backwards 4 months, and that's when I start those seeds. All right, with your kale plants bought or made up like we did here, it's time to get them out into the garden. Now, if you did make your own, there's one more crucial step that we have to do. Plants grown in the comfy confines of indoors can't just be thrown outside. They need to be hardened off first. Soft, lush indoor foliage is no match for the rigors of outdoor life. Over the course of a week or so, gradually acclimatize your kale to the outdoors. Kale has a pretty extensive deep root system, so you're going to want at least a foot or more of soil depth. I picked this guy here to be my new kale bed, which coincidentally is my old kale bed. I grew red Russian kale in this bed last year, and as a biennial plant, it's gone to flower in its second year. Although I stopped harvesting from it around 4 months ago, I let it go to flower just to do my part in attracting more bees and pollinators this spring. But now it's time for this old kale to go. I'm going to replant this bed no-till style So all I have to do is cut down the old kale right at the root collar. Except in this case, I don't think even the sharpest secateurs is an option. Time for the trusty saw. So with the old kale plants removed, the bed looks to be in pretty good shape. No weeds really to speak of, and my trusty 8-year-old patch of green onions is still going strong. No-till planting really works, so I'm going to stick with it. First, I'll cover the bed with a layer of brown craft paper. This is going to start the next layer of growing. It'll suppress any weed seeds that may have blown in, and it's going to give the bed a fresh new soil layer to start with. The well-started roots of my new kale plants are going to have no trouble penetrating the wet paper, while the young weed seedlings are going to get choked out. Grabbing that same potting mix that we used to create the starters in the first place, we can finally go ahead and plant our kale. It just goes right in the surface of the wet paper. Literally, you'll never find an easier way to plant plants. Now, you don't have to plant your kale like this using the extra step with that paper. I just don't like to disturb my soil. But no question, just like any of your other vegetable plants, you can dig a hole and simply put the kale plant in that way. If you are using the paper barrier, keep in mind though, even if that paper is wet, it might not be enough on a hot day. To combat transplant shock, I do like to make sure that my kale plants are well watered prior to planting. It's just one more way to protect your young plants on those really warm days. You want to space your kale at least a foot apart, more for larger varieties. But if you zigzag and alternate the plantings in a pattern, you can squeeze in a few more plants. All right, easy stuff. Now, the tendency would be to water immediately, but that's just going to wash the soil away, and it's going to make a mess. Let's mulch first for a better result. Not only is that mulch going to hold the soil in place while we water, it's also going to lock in that moisture. And on top of that, it's going to keep the soil cool from the harsh sun. 2 key things for growing the best kale. All right, I'll go ahead and give the plants a good soaking, and our kale planting is done. Kale doesn't require much in the way of maintenance throughout its life cycle, other than keeping the bed weed-free and the soil moist. To get the most out of your kale plants though, they do enjoy a light fertilizing schedule. As we're growing purely for the leaves, a vegetative-focused harvest, our fertilizer should skew slightly higher in nitrogen. That's your first number on the label of any commercial fertilizer. I use an organic fish emulsion fertilizer for mine, dilute to the manufacturer's specs, and just water it into the surface of the bed. You don't really have to fertilize kale, but as a long-growing crop that can be harvested multiple times, feeding after each major harvest, or about once a month, really does help the plants to bounce back and stay healthy and productive. For harvesting, if you pick the lower, older foliage, leaving the top whorl intact, the plants are going to keep growing and keep producing for you. They'll likely do this for up to a year if the conditions are right. It's when the kale begins to flower that you should look at starting over. Like we said, kale is a biennial, so it's going to start flowering in its second summer. And once those flower buds appear, the foliage changes. It becomes smaller, tougher, and definitely more bitter. It's still edible, but hardly as tasty. For me, the kale plants have produced a lot, over a long period of time. They don't owe me anything. So if I have to cut them down after a year, that's okay. It's still a highly profitable crop. As a brassica, kale is susceptible to a few pests. The big 2 are cabbage butterflies and aphids. Aphids usually appear as a response to stress for the plants, but you'll often get outbreaks when you over-fertilize. For me, cabbage butterflies tend to be as random as their flight patterns, so I just deal with them as they come along. Manual removal with your hands or water seems to work best. Kale leaves are tough, they can take it. You don't really want to be spraying the foliage you eat with chemicals. Whenever pests hit, especially an outbreak, 9 times out of 10, something in the environment is out of whack. Okay, that was a big one. We covered a lot here regarding all aspects of growing kale, leaving no stone unturned. Let's go ahead and recap the finer points for maximum retention. Growing a successful kale crop is all about timing. And because kale plants are often started indoors under controlled conditions, this timing is relatively easy. Harvesting the best kale in cooler, moderate climates happens twice a year, on either side of summer. In warmer climates, aim for a big winter harvest though. Once you know when the best time to harvest your kale is for your region, work back 2 months and begin planting in the garden. Store-bought starters work great, but if you're making your own, seeds are started indoors roughly 4 months prior to that harvest time. Kale is planted at least a foot apart, 18 inches for larger varieties. Also, the roots need depth, at least 12 inches or more to really anchor and sustain the plant. Mulch heavily to prevent moisture loss and to mitigate those temperature extremes, and give a light fertilizing after every harvest to allow the plant to bounce back. Kale is a wonder plant for our gardens and a true superfood for us. If you still have space, give it a try this season. And hopefully today I've given you all the tools to growing the best kale ever. Happy growing. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. I appreciate the support more than you know. And if you're getting value from these videos, please like and share them to spread the word and help your fellow gardener to grow better.